Scott finally decides to go look for his wife, Warren's determined to die, and the team is betrayed by one of their own. Welcome to reading every X-Men comic ever. This week was all about catching up with the OG X-Men through in X Factor 12 through 22, with a little detour into hell at the end with Mephisto versus issues 2 and 3, which I honestly don't know why I read, but I'll get into that later. For now, let's focus on X Factor having their own personal worst week of all time. Like Jesus Christ, they could not catch a break, and that's saying something after they just went through the mutant massacre. With the slight exception of Beast, I think, every member of this team was going through it at some point or another. Scott and Warren obviously had the worst of it, but Bobby was not in a great place either. And Jean, well, despite her story kind of getting shoved under the rug, was also not in a great place. Her story involved her trying to get into contact with her sister Sarah, which Jean hasn't done since coming back to life. And when Jean can't get a hold of Sarah by phone, she and Scott go to the house right when it gets exploded by anti-mutant terrorists, who cite Sarah being pro-mutant as the reason they blew it up. Now, despite being in distress about where her sister could be and the fact that her house was just bombed, Jean's story just kind of ends, inspiring Scott to go talk and find his missing wife and child. And we never get an update on this story during this batch at all. It just kind of ends there. It's kind of unfortunate, but it's not at all surprising, especially for the time these were written, that the token woman story is sidelined for males. I guess, since we've already mentioned him, let's move on to Scott and his plot, which drives him insane, and I am not exaggerating. This man has lost it. He heads back to Alaska to actually talk to Madeline face to face, only to find that she nor their son are there at the home, and the home is completely empty and up for sale. He tries to do some investigating, but everywhere he looks is a complete dead end, and even worse, there is no proof of Maddie or the kid's existence at all. Now, for those of us who are also reading Uncanny X-Men, we know Maddie is alive, and she's in a San Francisco hospital. Scott, however, cannot be a reader. He is living in universe. And since the only thing he can find to prove that either Maddie or the baby ever existed in the first place is a baby rattle that was hidden behind a radiator, he starts going nuts, destroying his old house and seeing and hearing these visions of Xavier, Maddie herself, Jean, the Phoenix, eventually also Angel. And on top of that is, if things could get any worse, he then gets attacked by a sentinel, and then the cops tell him they've found an extremely disfigured body that matches Maddie's description. This plotline is so insane. Watching my favorite X-Man get progressively more and more insane as he so desperately tries to prove that his wife was real despite all evidence, or I guess lack of evidence, is kind of horrifying. He knows that they were real but can't prove it, and it gets to a point where he starts wondering if they were even real to begin with. Obviously, for us, there is something sinister going on here, but I can't lie, the whole thing's pretty damn compelling. There's something about watching a man just spiral into insanity that's very fun to read. And Scott's story does not end there, though, as once he has a funeral for Maddie, he heads back to New York to meet up with the rest of the team, and mainly try and talk an extremely pissed off and depressed Warren out of doing something rash. Spoiler alert, he doesn't get to have that conversation. Last we left Warren, he was hospitalized because his wings were broken beyond repair after the events of Mutant Massacre. Knowing this, he has resigned himself to his fate and accepted that he would die from his injuries, and planned on leaving all his fortune to X Factor so they could continue working on the mission they've all agreed upon. And then his wings were forcibly removed. And still convinced that the best course of action was his death, he kills himself. Now, this should have been a noble act, at least from Warren's point of view. However, He can't control what he doesn't know, and fate and a rat by the name of Cameron Hodge had other goddamn ideas. Imagine that. The guy whose idea it was for X Factor to pose as mutant hunters and feed into the mutant hate actually hates mutants. What a fucking surprise. If you can't tell, I'm being sarcastic. This was not some big surprise twist. And if I'm being honest, I don't think it was really written like it was supposed to be one. They got pretty blatant pretty fast with telling the audience that Hodge was up to something evil. I mean, one issue he's having a fishy phone call with an unknown recipient, and the next we see him monitoring the entire complex, talking about his plans coming together, and then manipulating a clearly unstable Scott. I mean, even after this reveal, we get drip fed things that he was doing behind the scenes. He manipulated Warren's will so that all the money that's supposed to go directly to X Factor goes to him for X Factor. And then we found out he was on the courts that voted for him to be incompetent. So, like, and Warren's ring's forcibly removed. So, like, this guy sucks. That's the big stuff from this week. What else happened? Oh, Bobby gets teleported to Asgard by Loki and then returned unable to control his powers. So that's a fun little flaw with the Iceman. And I figure a little tease of just how powerful he will get, or I guess is. Oh, and we also had Apocalypse collect his third horseman, Famine, who was a girl from Ohio. And then he threw all three of them at X Factor as a sort of test, I guess, which they almost won if it wasn't for Bobby's uncontrollable powers. He also got his fourth horseman, but we never really see who it is. Oh, we also got a couple new X Factor trainees. Skids officially stays and joins. Same with Leech and Caliban. Although I think Caliban is technically on X Factor proper. Tabitha, aka Boom Boom, shows back up and she joins the team. And then the gang save a kid named Richter, who was set up as a patsy for a group called The Right. And the trainees themselves actually have a couple of adventures on their own, which is super nice, as it makes them feel less like plot devices or like damsels in distress, and more like actual characters. Even if they do end up getting captured and being damsels in distresses by the end of this week's issues, when they're captured by the Right, led by Cameron Hodge. Is there anything else big that I'm missing? Oh, the Scott and Jean fight in issue 18. That was great. Loved it. Shout out my guy Leech for the save. But yeah, great culmination of all of the relationship drama that Jean and Scott have had since the start of this series, as well as tying it into Scott's delusions and insanity, as well as Hodge's manipulation of that. Just a great scene. But other than that, I think I've covered everything important. And all in all, this series continues to deliver. The characters and their development have been great, and the melodrama is as good as it's always been. The pacing and the writing have been excellent as well. Everything moves at a pretty quick pace, especially after Warren's apparent death, and I am never feeling bored or disinterested in a scene, at least for an extended amount of time. Anyways, those praising sentiments, however, are not shared by the other book I read this week, Mephisto Versus. Now, technically, I only read half of this 4-issue miniseries, with those being issues 2 and 3, as they're the only ones that primarily feature X-Men characters. And believe it or not, these were not enjoyable issues to read. Maybe if I'd read the full series, I'd have gotten more out of it, but I have a hard time believing that just based on what I did read. The writing here just feels so Silver Age. The way the characters are saying their names and explaining their powers, it all just feels so inorganic and stilted, especially in issue 2 with the X Factor team. The plot's also pretty uninteresting, as it's just Mephisto taking someone and then trading them up for someone more powerful, and for some reason it's always a woman. On top of all that, all of the characters on both X teams seem uncharacteristically stupid or out of character, and all for the sake of making the devil seem smarter. I also never felt any stakes or tension because he's the fucking devil. He can just kind of do or take whatever or whoever he wants, and nothing the heroes can do ever poses him a real threat. The one thing I did like was Mephisto acting like a stereotypical collector slash investor bro, but instead of comics or cards or action figures, he's collecting human souls. Those guys are kind of the devil and a plague on collectible spaces, so it was a fun parallel to see, even if it wasn't intentional. Despite all my ragging, I don't actually hate these two issues. They were kind of the worst issues I've read in a while, but they're nowhere near the worst issues I've read in the entirety of this journey through X-Men. And for me, they've kind of acted as a reminder for how bad things have been and can be, and also just how good the ongoing books I'm reading are. Otherwise, I think that's it. I think I've covered everything I want to cover. So yeah, that's it. Next week, we are back to Uncanny X-Men for a couple of issues, as well as some more crossovers, as the team seems to have pissed off more of the Marvel Universe. Very interested to see how that happened. And if you are too, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you then.